Okay, today I have the great pleasure to introduce you to someone who has become a good friend of mine. He's one of my coworkers. I work with a lot of really cool people. This is one of them. He's a software developer at Cycling 74. Has his hands in a lot of different pies, and I'm just really happy to get a chance to talk to him a little bit more about his background and stuff. His name's Tim Place. He's done a lot of things over his career. I'll let him talk about it. But suffice to say, he's a very fascinating guy, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. So, hey, Tim, how are you?
I'm good, Darwin. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks.
I feel humbled to be on here. There's like this pantheon of amazing people that you've interviewed.
Well,
And I'm not sure if I belong in that group or not. So,
well, it's gotten to be quite a list of interesting folks, that's for sure. But I absolutely think that you belong on there, yeah, for any one of a number of things that you've been involved with. So we'll get to a bunch of those, but let's start off by talking a little bit about what you're currently working on. What's some of the stuff that you've been doing lately?
well, I've been doing a lot of work in C++ and some of the more modern extensions to C++ and figuring out ways to structure how we create max objects. That's one thing I've been doing. And then also trying to go back and kind of bring back topics that I've taught at the university in terms of how do filters work, for example, and share that with the audience of Cycling 74.
Yeah, you've done some videos for that we've been able to share in a newsletter that have been pretty eye-opening for me. I was always able to follow the math because I would find a book that would tell me, here, do this. And what I found kind of remarkable about what you did was you kind of explained the concept behind it. And it turns out that, now I have to think less about which book I'm going to steal the code from because I sort of better know what it is I'm trying to accomplish. So it's pretty powerful.
Yeah, well, I don't have a strong math background. In high school, I remember we got to logarithms in the 11th grade, and I asked the teacher, like, well, where am I going to use this? Like, I don't need this to balance my checkbook, so what's the deal?
Right.
And the teacher couldn't give me an answer.
Yeah.
So basically, at that point, I checked out on math, and I didn't take any math courses at all until I was working on my doctorate. And then I'm working on my doctorate, and I'm in freshman algebra,
Wow.
figure out how this stuff works. So I'm sensitive to the musician's plight when it comes time for encountering math.
Well, I often talk when I'm teaching, and I talk about things like the scale object and stuff as ways of, sort of avoiding math by doing, something else, right? And I always kind of tease about how we're all artists because we self-selected right out of the math class, right? But in a lot of cases, what you're talking about is really important because, my wife, a few years ago, went back to school to get an updated teaching degree certification. And as part of that, she had to take a trigonometry class. And I was like, oh, trigonometry. I think I might remember what that looked like from 10th grade, right? And I looked at it, and all of a sudden I realized what I was looking at was a lot of the math behind audio, right?
Yeah.
And this idea that I too checked out on certain things and just never revisited them again. And when I needed to use those functions or whatever, I would always kind of depend on other people's work. It was kind of humbling, a humbling experience. So let's talk a little bit about your path. So you weren't into math until you were working on your doctorate. First of all, what was your path to get to trying to get your doctorate? Have you actually gotten your doctorate?
I'm what we would call ABD.
Okay.
I got to a point working on the doctorate where basically I was at a conservatory of music, and really the model there is that you're going to write, a concerto, a piano concerto with orchestra or something. And I was bringing in all kinds of crazy stuff, and I put together a proposed dissertation, which included like appendices with schematics for the Teabox sensor interface and all this C++ code. And like, there's all kinds of stuff that were required in order to realize my music. And they just looked at it and were like, we have no idea what to do with this. You need to like go back and do something that we can talk about. And at that time I had a kid and like everything was just kind of going crazy. I just gotten the Cycling 74 gig and the fire kind of fizzled out on that.
Right. So, I mean, has that school changed at all subsequently? I mean, it seems like, so this would have been what, maybe 10 years ago? Something like that?
Yeah, this would have been
10,
about
12
10
years ago.
ago.
It seems like a lot of universities have kind of changed their approach to things in the intervening decade. Do you think there's any chance that it would work again to show up with schematics in a max patch, or do you think that you don't have the desire anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have the desire anymore. I have a lot of other things going on, and the piece of paper would be great for my ego, but I don't really consider padding my ego to be a worthy pursuit. So,
oh man, see, I do, but that's just me.
That's most people, I think.
Yeah, I think maybe so. So your doctorate, the doctorate you were trying for was a music doctorate, right?
Yeah, DMA, Doctor of Musical Arts.
Okay, so explain to me the path of going from a high school student that apparently didn't care for math to a person attempting to get their music doctorate. How did you get from one place to that? Okay,
so if we go a ways back, between the 7th and 8th grade, my father brought home a new computer. And this new computer, among other things, had GW Basic on it. So you could launch that up in DOS. And I actually started writing programs over the summer and read the manual from Microsoft on how to program BASIC and did like silly stuff, role-playing games, and I wrote a database to keep track of my baseball cards, silly stuff. So I had this interest in technology, and I was in music all the way through to playing trombone. And then when I got to high school, we had this really amazing band director, and he was into film scoring. And so we had a studio in high school, and when I came in the door for my senior year of high school, the school had gotten a grant, and he had gotten a Kurzweil K2000, and we had Cakewalk 2.0, which had that Cal programming language in it.
Yes.
I don't know if you remember that or not.
I totally do.
And so my high school band director sat down and started teaching me all this stuff. And I actually did like a film score for a film that a friend of mine was doing over in the video studio, which like no high schools had video studios in the early 90s, but my high school did because we were in a wealthy suburb. So I got to, use SMPTE timecode and all this stuff in high school in the early 90s. And I was basically like, oh man, I want to write music for films coming out of high school. I was thinking that. I went to school for my undergraduate for music ed because my parents wanted me to be able to get a job. But basically I was taking 23 credit hours a semester so that I could do all of the composition stuff. Mm-hmm. And once I got to the end of that, I was like, I'm not going to go teach. I'm going to go, I'm going to go to grad school and write music. And, my undergrad, we were working with reel-to-reel machines, and we had a copy of Max 3.0 that nobody knew what to do with. And I kind of taught myself how to screw around with that a little bit. Yeah. So, I was kind of in this electronic music technology space all along. In 1998, which was my senior year of college, went to my first Seamus conference. It was at Dartmouth University. And the first session that I went to, the first paper session, David Ziccarelli was there. And he showed us this version of Max that processed audio. Like I had screwed around with Max a little bit. Mostly I used it to do stupid stuff. Like I would map the pitch bend wheel on a controller to we had an ESI 32 sampler. Okay. And if you blasted it with enough node-ons out of the pitch bend wheel, you could get it to hang. And when it did, it made these incredible sounds. And I could jump into Pro Tools and use it as part of a texture. So I was just doing stupid stuff. But once I saw that you could do audio signals, because David was showing MSP, which was brand new, I was like, holy cow. And that's really where I started following the rabbit down the hole.
All of a sudden, you didn't have to depend on breaking a sampler in order to get a great sound, huh?
Yeah. And it didn't take long before I was like, well, shoot, I want an object to do this. I want an object to do that. So then I, with the help of grad school of Ichiro Fujinaga, I learned how to write Max externals so I could start doing more stuff. And basically, I learned C and C++ from the Max SDK and drinking a lot of coffee at Barnes & Noble. This is Google wasn't really a thing yet. Right. So I was a musician with a programming hobby.
Right. Programming problem. Yeah.
Backwards from.
Yeah. So what instrument were you playing?
Trombone.
Interesting. Because trombone isn't normally what you think of too as sort of like a entree instrument into electronic music. Was it just what you started with in grade school and so you just stuck with it, or?
It is what I started with in grade school. My grandfather played the trombone. And I grew up, my mom, her favorite band was Chicago. So I grew up listening to Chicago all the time. And I had trombone kind of infused into me.
Right, I hear you.
And it's not the prototypical instrument in terms of when you think about interactive computer music or whatever.
Right.
But I do think that the trombone sound, it has this certain fatness and resonance to it that gives you a real ear for analog synthesis types of sounds. So for me, actually, it's a real natural.
It's a natural fit, yeah.
Because of the timbral qualities.
Right. Well, there's also the fact that it sort of has user definable tuning to a certain extent that can open your ears. Because I always feel like one of the things that's important that when I talk to people who become experimental in their music interests, there's always some prefacing points, right? The things that open their ears to something new. And sometimes it's grandpa's record collection, right? Or dad's record collection. Sometimes it's, I ran across this instrument and it broke my head open. Or I ran across an album that at a store that had a cool cover and it blew my head open. But I always think too that there has to be some things that you sort of experience. And I think with trombone and the fact that it doesn't have this like fretted or specific pitch orientation, actually it forces your ear to hear the spaces between notes. And I think that's really useful as you expand your musical repertoire.
That's absolutely true in my experience as well.
So for you, what is the thing that cracked your head open for experimentalism? Was it that working with this band director, did he introduce you not only to programming and SMPTE, but also more experimental music areas? Because certainly film scoring can go that way.
It can, but he was more of a jazz, he was more into jazz charts and that type of thing. He wasn't particularly experimental. It wasn't until I got to college and got introduced to more of the experimental stuff where it was okay, there was a composition professor there named Paul Steinberg who took me under his wing, and there weren't a lot of comp students, and especially not a lot of comp students that were interested in the electronic stuff. But he was like, okay, here's your listening list. You're going to go listen to Morton Subotnick's Silver Apples in the Moon, and you go up to the library and get out the reel-to-reel. So we still listen to stuff in the library on reel-to-reels.
Oh man!
And start listening to some stuff. And I was already open to all the synthesizer stuff anyway. You mentioned Dad's record collection. It's like my father had this stack of these 8-track cassettes. And there were bootlegs of Emerson, Lake and Palmer concerts.
Okay.
So I already had the synthesizers and everything in my brain, and yeah, I mean, I really got fascinated, I think, from watching live concerts. The thing that fascinated me, the thing that still fascinates me is, I don't know if you remember back in the, I don't know, it's probably early 90s. There were these ads in the magazines and also on TV, is it live or is it Memorex?
Right,
And,
right.
and, and that was that was actually like an aesthetic thing that I adopted. I like it to have a performer on stage performing with all these electronics, but there always to be this ambiguity about like, well, is that coming from the performer or is that coming from the electronics or what's going on? So that
Right.
there's sort of like this mystical, supernatural, otherworldliness, but it's still grounded. So the electronic sounds aren't like divorced from reality. And you're kind of forced to confront as a listener, like, well, what's going on here? So that's
Is that the kind of composition stuff that you were doing as you advanced through your degree program? Were you trying to sort of do that mix and match of technology? Because clearly you said you started writing Max externals with the help of a collaborator, and when I first got to know you, you had a pretty significant library of Max tools because that you called the tap tools. You also by then were, I think you had already, or you were just gotten to the point of having the Teabox sensor interface pulled together, and you were starting to put together different sensing devices. Was all of this driven by your interests and the compositions that you were doing at the time, or were you driven by something else?
it was the compositions at the time. I mean, the tap tools was like, I want to do this piece and I need a reverb. And there's
Mm-hmm.
no free, the only free VST reverb is the free verb, and it sounds like a dead dog in a garage. And and I need a pitch shifter, and the only pitch shifter available for Max is in this ear cam package you have to pay a lot of money for, and I'm a poor college student.
Right.
So it's like I would basically the tap tools were like, oh, I want to do this thing, and I need an object to do it. And so yeah, I eventually, there ended up being like 100 objects in that
So
monstrosity of a
right,
package.
right.
But
So I can see that because that seems like a modest jump. Like I need this one thing to accomplish a task. I'm going to do this one thing. And especially with the Max SDK, once you kind of learn how it operates, then doing the next thing isn't that big of a leap, right? How the hell did you do the Teabox? So for those who aren't familiar, the Teabox is a sensor interface that used SPDIF audio interface to get high-speed sensing data into the computer. Is that a fair assessment?
that is correct.
Okay. So how do you just say, gee, I need a sensor box and I'm going to design an audio interface? Yeah, it
Yeah.
seems like an improbable jump.
Well, I was helping Jesse Allison, who's now at LSU.
Mm-hmm.
I was working with him on some of his installations, trying to help him figure out how to do the sensor stuff, and then we collaborated on some installations. And I mean, just like there was always something frustrating or wrong about the whole deal. And it was like the USB ports on the Mac and the G4s and the G3s, they were just like, they were so unreliable. We had an installation at ICMC in Gothenburg, Sweden, and the computer would just freak out and lose its USB ports. So like we were trying to do this thing with the basic stamp and whatever, communicating to a serial port through a serial to USB converter, and then you have to go over and restart the computer at least once or twice a day because of the USB port problem.
Okay.
So it's like I did not want anything to do with USB ports. So like, how are you going to get stuff into the computer if you can't use the USB port? That's like kind of an issue.
Right.
So it's like, well, we could use an audio signal. So actually, we had some versions that would use these little 555 timers,
Yeah.
which is just like a little square wave generator thing. And then we would like count the zero crossings on the as the audio stream. We also we just tried a whole bunch of different stuff, and
Hmm.
and it all like had different problems. But we were presenting one of those things where we were sending a bunch of sine waves in, and then running a bunch of bandpass filters in MSP, and we were trying to track the RMS envelope of the sine waves for our
Okay.
sensor data,
All right.
but it wasn't very responsive. So anyway, I was at the NIME conference in Montreal in 2003, which had two big things. One is that I talked with Ali Momeni, and then we ended up developing the hypnoscope and Hipno and stuff out of
All
his
right.
work from that conference. But the other one was with the sensor stuff. Jesse and I were talking with David Wessel, and we spent quite a bit of time talking to David Wessel, and he agreed with like all of our assessment of all of the problems, and he's like, well, I wonder if you could we have this Remus box over here, and we're taking sensors and blah blah blah, but you could probably do something more like what you're doing if you just sent the audio over a SPDIF connection. We're like, oh, how about that? So really it was kind of a David Wessel idea. And I mean, that man he always had amazing ideas. He was amazingly generous
Yeah.
with sharing them and supporting people to run with them. So
Yeah.
that's how we got the idea.
That's cool.
Then we had the big learning curve. But I mean, it was the same thing. Just go hang out at Barnes and Noble and like look at all the books. Back when Barnes and Noble had a lot of books, you know.
Yeah. Now they have like Legos and stuffed toys filling up half the store.
Yeah, there was this O'Reilly book they had on the shelf at Barnes and Noble. It was designing embedded hardware,
Oh wow.
and so it was kind of like a no-brainer to buy that book.
Yeah. No
But
kidding.
I mean, it was a lot of work for a couple of musicians to do that.
So you
And
literally learned the electronics and everything just out of Barnes and Noble books?
so mostly, yes. Um, the We had another saving grace though, which is that my father's an electrical engineer,
Oh, nice.
and if
Nice.
we got in over our heads,
Dad.
yeah,
Not
exactly.
actually not the typical dad I need help call from college, I would guess, but
Right.
it's not like dad I got busted.
Yeah. My dad loved it because it was
I'll
like,
bet.
it was like he thought all of us kids should go into science and engineering,
Hmm.
and then I went to college for music, and my sister went to college for art. And, it was like we started down this road of like
Right.
nobody doing science and engineering. And
Well,
here
although
I am, the prodigal son coming home.
yeah, really. Although you know what, I actually believe that I think that there's a lot of place for studied engineers, but I know an awful lot of people who got engineering degrees back when I wasn't getting mine, who are unemployed because all the engineering they learned back then is useless now, right? I mean, the engineering fields change pretty fast, and especially it's almost like the more detail you get into, the worse off you eventually end up with in your career. So, where art is always useless. So, so there's that. But that's really interesting and sort of mind bending to think of taking on that kind of task. It's pretty interesting. Now you mentioned the work on the Hypnoscope and the Hipno plugin project. Um, the interface for that was pretty unique because it used this node-based thing that was automatable in VST world, and it was really it was very unique for how plugins worked up to that, in comparison to that point. Um, but there was also, I mean, it wasn't just that interface. There was also a lot of kind of weirdo techniques that a lot of the plugins provided. What was all that stuff kind of things that you had come up with while you were in school, or did you just, or was it more like, hey, I have to make plugins. What's the weirdest stuff I can come up with?
There's some of both.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Once we had that interface, it made it possible to use some things I'd experimented with previously that didn't work very well.
Okay.
Because some of those plugins are really particular and real tweaky with the settings, and you could like have a bunch of settings that, depending on the sound source, might do nothing,
Right.
or might just produce silence. And then if you
Okay.
change the sound source, then all of a sudden you've got like Star Wars going on.
Right.
So that hypnoscope really made it so that some of these effects would work with a wide variety of sounds, because you could like basically like swim through or navigate through this like whole terrain of sounds. And so I had all these like sort of dead experiments sitting on my computer, and then the granular things were done by Nathan Wollick,
Mm-hmm.
now at Stetson University. And he had this whole like pool of things that he used in performance all the time. So a lot of those granular plugins were things he'd already been performing with, and we added the hypnoscope to it.
I see.
So, and Jesse also added some stuff to that package, because at that point we had started Electrotap, which was basically the company we used to finance the Teabox development.
I see. Right.
Once we couldn't get any grants to pay for it, we decided we have to start a company to pay for it.
Well, if I remember, Electrotap kind of did a bunch of stuff. So you did the Teabox. You also did a bunch of sensors. And at the time, as I recall, they were sort of like the highest quality sensors people could buy. So other people that would get sensor boxes like the Kroon or some of these other things would still come to you to buy their sensors, right?
Yeah, I mean, and the sensors we were selling they're still really good. I mean, the Teabox is actually still really good too, but I mean, it's cost prohibitive now because the price that people are willing to pay has gone way, way down.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, all the sensors, they had like this little conditioning circuit. So every sensor, right by the sensor itself, there'd be an op amp, and I mean, it would basically like get the signal into the perfect range with lots of power to drive it over a long cable.
Right.
And over a long cable with a balanced signal, so it would be immune to
noise and stuff.
To RF interference. And
right. So, but also, weren't you at one point also making hemispheric speakers? Am I remembering that right?
Well, so my friend Stephen Moore, Stephen and I lived in Baltimore at the same time. Okay. And he had started producing these hemispheric speakers with some of the folks at Rensselaer. And we had this company, so it was like, hey, we've already got the mechanism to like process credit cards and stuff, which wasn't as easy then as it is now.
Right.
But we had all the infrastructure in place, and he was looking for a way to get these things out in the world. So we acted basically as a reseller.
I see.
Him. And I helped him make a batch of 45 of them one summer week. But
that was like that. Those had become sort of like the standard part of the standard rigging of laptop orchestras. That's where I mostly saw them in play. Every laptop orchestra would have one of these floor-sitting hemispheric speakers in front of each performer, kind of making it so that it seemed like the sound was coming from the performer instead of just like, some stereo pair of speakers behind everybody.
Yeah, I mean, there's that aspect of it. There's also the aspect that they just look cool, and all the crap you throw. I mean, which I don't think should be downplayed, because like all the crap you throw on stage is part of your performance,
right?
And I kind of like, I hate random wires and random crap on the stage, but like if you have one of these hemispheric speakers, it seems like it's intentional and it's supposed to be part of the art.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And then if you're playing with live performers, they seem to blend so much better because the sound's radiating in all directions, and you can have it up there on the stage near the performer. It's not like the performer's in the center of the stage. And the sound is like this disembodied stuff coming out from 50 feet on either side of the performer.
Yeah, I had a chance to use those a fair bit, both with the Boulder Laptop Orchestra, as well as just some guest spots that I did. And one of the things I noticed it was interesting the way that people would interact with each other when they were using hemispheric speakers. It seemed like the reason that things were blending is because I no longer felt like I had to like goose my volume to find out if that was really me coming out the speaker, right? I could instead, if I was too loud, I couldn't hear anybody else. And so that would be sort of like a detriment to me as a player, and I would naturally want to turn down. It had the right kind of reward punishment system for an artist in a way that was really useful, I thought.
Yeah, definitely.
So now yet another thing that you did during this time period, or maybe shortly thereafter, is start working on these kind of like musical device frameworks. And it's falling out of my head. But now you're still involved in the Jamoma project. We interviewed Tron Lussus a while ago about it, but you're involved with that. But what was the predecessor to that? I can't remember.
There's this standalone app I made with Max called Jade.
Jade, that's the one I was trying to think of. Yes. Yep. And that was sort of like a bunch of modules that you could that were predefined. And then Jamoma is like an open source, open framework spin off of that, right?
Yeah. So what happened is I made all these modules for Jade, and then I had this standalone app that would kind of script them into place and automate them over the course of time, so that I could get through my various pieces of music that I was trying to do things like turn off the DSP processing of things not used and that type of stuff. So Trond had me over to Norway. This was back in, my memory's starting to fade now, maybe 2003 or thereabouts.
Okay.
And I gave some talks and presentations of it, and then Trond was like, so Jade is great, but the really important thing about this is this modular framework, and it really should be open sourced. Really ought to be like this system for programming these things, for creating these things, so that they can interoperate, and also so that you can collaborate with other people more effectively. And so I thought about that, and I agreed with him, and Jamoma was born.
So has that really been going for like 13 years then?
Well,
how long did it take you to get started with just building the framework out?
It was a great idea, but I had a lot going on. Okay. And in 2005 is really when it took off. So it kind of like sat there, not going anywhere real fast for a while. And I had a really sort of depressing job interview for an academic position at Cornell University. And I needed something to distract myself on the flight home. And somehow I started working on what's now Jamoma on that flight. And so I sent Trond an email. I was like, hey, you want to get going on this? And he was like, yeah, now's a perfect time. And awesome. So got it kicked off.
Tell us like the genesis of it and where it's at now. Where do you think of it as now? I mean, is it Max based, or has it been genericized?
It is somewhat genericized.
Okay.
So there are different parts there's a lot of different tentacles to it, and everything operates at sort of like there's this underlying framework in C++ that makes all of everything happen. And then there's Max wrappers for all of those objects. And there's also pure data wrappers for not all of them, but for some of them. And I don't use pure data so much, so I can't speak to exactly what the status of the pure data side of things is. But and then there are also people that just use the C++ part directly. There's some guys in France that have done a bunch of game engine development with it.
Oh, interesting.
In terms of the Max package, I mean, we worked on it for like 10 years before we released version 1.0. It wasn't like we were moving things along slowly either. We were getting together once, sometimes twice a year for a week over in Europe and hacking on things. And probably most projects would call it version 4 or 5, but we kept the version number low so we could break everything.
Right. Gave you the freedom, right?
Which we did many times. But we put 1.0 on it, and I mean, it really is as stable as you could ever hope for, and it's been used in a lot of projects. And
right.
So
you mentioned again C++. What's your fascination with C++? I would think that, with your experience doing performances and all this kind of stuff, that you would be more focused on the tactical process of getting something on stage. But it seems like you're actually moving farther away from the stage and more into the tool development part of things. And that's kind of surprising given your background. Is that why make that choice?
So that's a really good question. And I don't know if I'm prepared to give a coherent answer on that. But I am always interested in systems. So in how parts work together. And that's true musically, that's true engineering wise. And so putting together some sort of system of things is more interesting to me than maybe making just like a monolithic beast to get through a performance or something. I don't know if that's an adequate answer or not, but
it helps understand. I mean, you don't do electrotap or any of that kind of work anymore, right?
Yeah, it just became too much. And as I have 2 kids now, and I exercise now. I didn't exercise in my 20s, I need to do that to be healthy.
Sure.
And there's a lot to do, and it was really hard to let electrotap go.
I'll bet. Well, because that was really kind of the leverage out of school into a professional career world, right? That's got to be hard to walk away from.
Yeah, a lot of my ego is wrapped up in it, and but yeah, I mean, and actually, electrotap was the reason when I was still trying to get academic position. A lot of those schools, the reason they were interested in interviewing me when there weren't very many composition jobs open was because I had this experience with business, and they're thinking like, well,
maker stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, this was a little before the maker stuff took off, but they were all thinking like, if we could find some other way to get money coming in the door, because this whole technology transfer idea.
Right. Everybody wanted to hire the next John Chowning, right?
We want the next John Chowning.
Right. Oh man, that's crazy. Well, man, we've burned through the time already, but I want to stay on track here for a little longer. So now, so you sort of explained, why moving away from the stage a little bit. Why C++? Again, there are so many things that are like current and hot and groovy languages. Why are you focusing on C++?
C and C++ are still the way that most people are writing DSP software for audio. Mm-hmm. And I care about audio first and foremost.
Okay.
So, yes, you can do audio with a lot of these JavaScript things and web browsers and stuff. On the back end, a lot of those, what they're doing is they're translating stuff into C or C++,
right.
So that they can run the stuff fast enough. Because of my audio orientation, it's a natural fit. Also, that's where I've spent my time working for the last however many years, and I'm gotten to the point where that's where I feel the most fluent and the most proficient.
Sure, sure, that makes a lot of sense.
There's a lot of things historically that have been super annoying about C++ in particular, but the modern versions of C++ are really addressing a lot of the ugliness and gotchas of the old ways.
So I have a peculiar question, but it's one that happens to be in my head right today. Actually, tomorrow I'm supposed to go to a high school and talk to a bunch of music students about careers in music and technology. One of the things that I find difficult is being able to translate what I went through in order to get in the industry into what I can express to them about possibilities of getting into things, right? I'm curious if you have any insights about how you might suggest people who want to become the next you. How do they do that? I mean, do they focus on engineering? Do they focus on hardware? Is it just like don't bother? There's nothing here. What do you think is the vision for people who want to do what you're doing?
Well, I don't know what the vision is for people that want to do what I'm doing, but I know what I did. And I mean, what I did is the same thing that I think most artists or musicians do, which is that you don't plan on having one thing be your entire pie. You got to find a bunch of different pieces and try to put together a whole pie, hopefully. So, I mean, what I was doing, I mean, I was writing software. I had Tap Tools, for example, and I was selling that, and I was getting meager royalty checks from ASCAP, and I was doing music copying in Finale, you know, for people that wanted their music input into the computer so it could be printed out.
Right.
And I was helping people with Max patches, and I was teaching adjunct, you know, one class at the Kansas City Art Institute and one class at UMKC. You know, just try to put together enough things. Eventually, I had some, you know, consulting for Cycling 74, which I was super appreciative of. But I mean, all that time, you know, you're still always looking and still.
Right.
And eventually, I mean, in my case, one of those pieces became big enough that it became the whole pie. And now the whole pie is Cycling 74. But I had to put together a whole bunch of different pieces, and they were all diverse. You know, eventually one took over. But I think that's the typical artist way to put together a living and
put together a career, right? Yeah, that's actually that's an important and good point. I appreciate that. Now, the other thing I want to ask you, because you work with Cycling 74, but specifically because you're on the development side, and you know you're building things, right? And you get to see from a technical standpoint the direction that things are moving. What is your vision for the future of the music industry, and very specifically the music software thing? Where is that going? Because on one hand it looks like, well, hey, everyone's going to get to be a programmer, but at some point it's like, yeah, but you still need people that are focused on the artistry rather than coding, right? So there's a thing there. You know, where do you see the future of sort of like art and technology and all of that interaction? Where do you think that that's going?
I have absolutely no idea.
Well, you're no help.
No, I'm not any help. I mean, I have asked myself the question. I just have no idea whatsoever.
That's interesting, but maybe that's the healthiest approach, because I think if you're not sure, then maybe you're not going to jump to early conclusions, right?
Right. I mean, in some ways, I feel like there's so much breadth of musical practice that I'm still learning things that are really old school things.
Right.
As an example, there was something that you did in the beep videos for Cycling 74 recently where you were like, oh, I'm going to use a separate envelope generator on the cutoff frequency than the gain, and I'm just going to shorten this one up a little bit. And it was like, I was like, wow, that is just like, I never knew that little trick before.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, and it's just a little trick, but those little tricks, I mean, that makes a big difference in the musical output of the
Right.
thing. And I'm still learning old stuff, you know. I'm not necessarily thinking that some new thing is coming down the road that's going to change my life any more than learning the old thing.
And
It's a kind of a strange dichotomy to be developing stuff that's sort of like the bleeding edge software, but then also with eyes toward the past at the same time.
sure. Do you still do performances or work with performers at all?
It's been, how long has it been? I think it's been 5 years since I did a performance.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
After having the second kid, it got more challenging. And that last performance was fun. I'm starting to get back to the point where I would like to perform again.
Starting to get the itch again.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of burned out a little bit. I was really, as a perfectionist about a lot of things, which means you're holding yourself to a high standard, but usually you're holding other people to the same ridiculous, stupid standard. And I got to the point where it was hard for me to enjoy music.
I see.
To be honest, it's like this year I've listened to more music than I probably have in the previous 5 combined.
Interesting.
It's like the joy of it has come back.
Who's got your ear right now?
Well, I just went to the Seeger Rose concert. I know they're not they're not new, but you know,
it's pretty incredible though.
It's pretty incredible to go to a Seeger Rose concert.
Yeah,
they only come through here once every few years.
Sure.
So I've been digging up all the old Seeger Rose stuff.
Nice. Well, Tim, I want to thank you so much for taking the time and having a chat. For kind of talking about not only your history, but how that path looked and how it felt. You know, that's the one thing I like is when people kind of express not only what they did, but how they felt when it was going on. Because that can be sometimes hard to keep clear, right? So I appreciate that. So with that, then I'm going to say goodbye. Have a great rest of your day, man.
Okay, well, thank you, Darwin. I really appreciated spending time with you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Catch you later.
Mm-hmm.
Many thanks to Tim for his time talking over things. It's really interesting to hear about what it feels like working on your PhD, what it feels like kind of trying to find a way to get that trickle of nickels going. Very interesting stuff. I want to also thank you, the listeners, for keeping on with me. Got some really exciting stuff coming up in the next couple of weeks. So this is all because you guys have stuck with me over the years. I want to thank you so much for it. With that, I'm going to sign off for the day. Have a good one. Bye.